Hello, everyone. It's Mr. Lopez once again, and we're continuing with Chapter 2 this week, and we should finish the remainder of what we have, sections 2.4 through 2.6. Now, pretty much we're going to start off where we kind of covered some of the topics last time. So if you recall in the earlier part of Chapter 2, we talked about how energy is passed along. And so we're going to talk about the different types of energy that we see throughout our environment and throughout the various ecosystems that we run into on a daily basis. So, I mentioned before, nearly all life on Earth comes from the sun. The sun releases photo energy, which is, of course, then captured by various organisms that are capable of photosynthetic conversion, which will allow them to convert that photo energy into usable chemical energy. And so we usually term these individuals as primary producers because they create the majority of the necessary carbohydrates and other compounds that we need to survive. For example, plants usually release oxygen as a byproduct, which is a necessary chemical that we need to survive, of course. And of course, and we get them in other ways as well. For example, in parts of the world where you might not have uh, access to sunlight, for example, in the deepest parts of the water, they have to be able to obtain their energy in different forms because even the plant life down there is not too dependent on photo energy. So usually these organisms will obtain their energy from something called chemosynthesis, which is a process that allows them to extract energy from inorganic chemical compounds such as hydrogen sulfide. And there tends to be a lot of hydrogen sulfide at the base of the ocean floors because you usually see a release of a lot of geothermal energy from the Earth crust, where you have cracks in the Earth crust that releases some plumes of gases and heat. And usually these gases contain a lot of hydrogen sulfide, which is then used to convert energy by a lot of the organisms down there. And we didn't really know a lot about this until about just 30 years ago. We didn't really, understand what organisms live down there or how they survive. But obviously, with the advent of new technology and the fact that we have systems that can survive in those pressures, they've been able to discover a lot of new organisms as well as how they survive in these types of environment. So, for example, in this image that we see coming up, we see some examples of producers that use chemosynthesis to survive. And so, what we're looking at here is a colony of what we call tube worms and mussels, or otherwise known as oysters, as they cluster over a cool deep sea methane seep in the Gulf of Mexico. So they're kind of consuming that gas, that methane gas, which is why they're all piled up in that same region. And of course, they will convert that methane into a usable form of energy that will allow them to survive in that deep pressure trench. So most of you probably already know this. It's something that you've learned probably even in junior high biology. But of course, the green plants do get their energy from the sun. As it says here in this first bullet, there's thermonuclear reactions that occur in the sun that usually emit powerful forms of radiation, including potentially deadly ultraviolet and nuclear radiation. And this is why it's such an important thing that we are able to conserve as much of our atmosphere as possible. Because without the atmosphere, we would be directly exposed to these deadly ultraviolet and nuclear radiation. So what the atmosphere does is it's able to filter the sun into a more usable form, which we will then convert through photosynthesis into plant food that we can then eat and consume. And of course, nearly all organisms on the Earth's surface depend on solar radiation because it's much more than just energy, but it also provides warmth, heat, and it provides a sustainable environment in which we can all survive. Now, of course, you do have the definition here of what photosynthesis is, which is usually the conversion of light energy into useful chemical energy in the bonds that hold together organic molecules. Now, you might have noticed in the last slide, we talked a little about inorganic molecules. And what inorganic and organic does, really what the difference is the presence or absence of carbon. So we as human beings are called organic life form because the backbone of our chemical structure is carbon, while inorganic compounds usually lack carbon. So a good example of an inorganic compound would be table salt, which has the chemical formula of sodium chloride NaCl. There is no carbon there. And it's just a little bit of information that I figure that you need to know when you study organic compounds. Now here we see a general view of what the electromagnetic spectrum includes. And within this spectrum, we have things like microwaves, radio waves, gamma rays, X-rays, and ultraviolet. However, in the midst of this spectrum, we are only able to see everything that falls in the visible light spectrum. So somewhere between zero point 0.4 micrometers and zero point 0.7 micrometers, we can only see that much of the actual light. And of course, we perceive everything as white light, but it can become broken up into 7 different colors. Some of y'all may have heard these names. We usually use Roy G. Biv as an acronym to remember the various colors of the visible spectrum. But of course, you may have heard of all the other ones like X-rays. You've heard of ultraviolet rays and even microwaves. So we are familiar with other parts of the spectrum. However, we can only see the visible light portion of the spectrum. So how do photosynthetic beings capture light energy? Well, of course, as I mentioned before, this all occurs in a process known as photosynthesis, where usually most organisms that have this ability have to have an organelle known as a chloroplast. Now, this chloroplast will reside within plant cells. Again, we don't find these in human beings because we don't have the capability to photosynthesize. And usually, these chloroplasts will contain a pigment known as chlorophyll. Now, this chlorophyll pigment is what allows for the absorption of a lot of the sunlight energy. And so, within this overall reaction known as photosynthesis, we have 2 smaller yet important independent reactions that are known as the light dependent and light independent reactions. And just by looking at the name, you can kind of venture a guess as far as why they're called what they're called. For example, light dependent depends on light, while light independent can be done separately without the use of light. And so you see an image here on the left that kind of briefly summarizes what it is that's going on. So you have sunlight energy being absorbed by the chlorophyll. This kind of energizes the light dependent reactions, which causes a release of oxygen, which we need. And in turn, it produces a lot of smaller molecules that can then power the light independent reaction, which usually results in the production of carbohydrates, or primarily known as glucose, which the body needs to survive. So the glucose produced by photosynthesis is an energy-rich molecule that fuels all metabolic processes of cells. If you ever take a nutrition class or an anatomy and physiology class, you'll come to realize that glucose is such an important molecule to power the human body. So it's great that the plant will ultimately make some forms of glucose that can then be used to be consumed and then power our bodies. Now, the energy that is found in the chemical bonds can be released in a process called cellular respiration, which is the reverse of photosynthesis. So while we don't have photosynthesis because we don't have the capability to do that, we are able to do cellular respiration. And if you actually look at the formula of cellular respiration, it is the inverse of what is required for photosynthesis. So, for example, plants need an intake of water and carbon dioxide in order to create glucose. But you look at this formula here, and it's the opposite. So we're looking at glucose at the far left, C6H12O6. And of course, we intake oxygen to help power our bodies. And this creates a reaction which then releases water, carbon dioxide, and energy. And again, if you flip this equation around, it forms photosynthesis. So it's important that you understand that they both relate to one another. And so again, we saw an image similar to this earlier in the chapter, but we see how energy is being exchanged throughout an ecosystem. Of course, it all starts off with the sun, diffusing light energy that powers the production of photosynthesis, which releases oxygen as a byproduct, and is also eaten by an organism. In this case, it's a plant. The rabbit will use that energy that's found in a plant to power itself. Eventually, that plant will die. Or excuse me, that animal and plant will die, and the energy that's left behind will be decomposed by worms and fungi, which will then create more energy in the form of CO2 and water being released. And so it's just this continuous circle of life. that never ceases, even if once we pass away. So it's important, again, to understand how it is that we interact with our ecosystem, to see how we provide the resources that the ecosystem needs, as well as how they produce the resources that we need. It says here that while many biologists study life at the cellular and molecular level, ecologists study interaction at the species, population, biotic community, or ecosystem level. So what's really important about ecologists is that they're not so focused on how we function, but how we function together with other beings, other organisms. In other words, how do we interact with dogs, cats, plants, trees, the bodies of water? How do we interact together? Are they beneficial? Is it parasitic in nature? Are we harmful? Different things like that. So that's what an ecologist does. And of course, you have to be able to understand the different types of species that there are. And so here we see what species really means. In biology, species refers to all organisms of the same kind that are genetically similar enough to breed in nature and produce live, fertile offspring. And that's really the key part right there, is that species have to be able to produce live, fertile offspring, meaning offspring that can then themselves produce offspring later on. And this is why if you try to mate a donkey with a horse, you do get offspring. However, these offspring, which are known as the mule, cannot produce any children of their own because they are not fertile. Therefore, they are kind of an abomination, if you would want to use that word. And this is why we as human beings can't mate with anything else. We can only mate with human beings, because if we were to try to mate with something else, we probably would not produce any fertile offspring. So that is what a species is. Now, of course, as we see other terms here that are used a lot in the study of environment and the study of ecology, but they're all very important terms. For example, we see the term here, population. And the definition says that population consists of all the members of a species living in a given area at the same time. So a good example of a population would be like a group of people living in a city. For example, here, every time I drive to BIOL, whether I'm coming in from the north, the west, the east, or the south, I always run into a population sign that tells me how many people are living in BIOL. And we all have something similar to this, I'm sure, in the area that we live in. And so what it's referring to is, when we see that population sign, it's referring to how many human beings or the species of humans that are living in that area. Not squirrels, not dogs, not cats, but just people. So a population, again, is relation to a single species, but how many of them are living together. And of course, when you have a group of populations of varying species, that makes up a community. So us living together with squirrels, dogs, cats, deers, trees, various plants, that is what we call a community. Okay. And of course, the ecosystem is all of these things living together within their physical environment. So this is how we interact with our atmosphere, with the land, the water, as well as all the other organisms that live with us. And it is through this functioning ecosystem that we're able to develop things like food chains, food webs, where we kind of all interact with one another. And again, if you've ever seen a movie like The Lion King, you've probably heard the story of the circle of life. And that's as silly as it might sound to refer to that movie, a Disney movie. I mean, it does hold truth in that we are very dependent on this circle of life, on how we interact with other species around us. And it says here that in an ecosystem, some consumers feed on a single species, but most consumers have multiple food sources. And we are a great example of that. We can eat pretty much anything, plant, animal-based, and regardless of what kind of animal it is or what kind of plant it is, we can survive off multiple food sources. Similarly, though, some species are prey to a single kind of predator, but many species in an ecosystem are beset by several types of predators and parasites. So you look at, for example, a deer out in the wild. A deer has many predators. Us being one of them. We see, especially during deer season, we see many human beings going out to, catch deer, but they're also having to watch out for any other type of predatory animals that might be out there that might kill them, like a bear, or in some places like a mountain lion, a bobcat, other species out there that might try to eat these deer. So, in this way, individual food chains become interconnected to form a food web. So, there's a difference between a chain and a food web. Food chains are directly connected. For example, if we eat a rabbit, obviously that's part of our food chain. But if we want to include a rabbit, a deer, a fish, we are all connected to them, and that creates a food web. And so here we see an example of what a food web looks like. And particularly, we're looking at a food web of an African savanna. And we see how many of these individual species are connected to a multitude of species, whether they are predator or they are prey. And so, again, it's a food chain, but ultimately, when you put them all together amongst an ecosystem, they are all food web. And we see a little bit of everything here. We see insects, we see plants, we see trees, we see bacteria, dead organisms. All these together create the food web. And you see that there's many different levels. We call these trophic levels. For example, we have primary producers, which are the ones that produce food in the form of energy, in this case plants. And then we see primary consumers, which are usually herbivores. And these herbivores will then consume primarily plants. That's what herbivores do. And right above them are the secondary consumers. For example, an aardvark that might eat an ant, or things like that. But then you have the top consumer, the top of the food chain, which are usually the meat eaters. Things like lions, cheetahs, hyenas. These are all the top of their food chain. And of course, you could say that we, the human beings, are probably at the very top of the food chain. And so here we see kind of a definition of what all these individual terms mean, whether it's a trophic level, a primary producer, consumer. And of course, what the category that we fall into the most is what we call an omnivore. We do eat both plant and animal matter. Okay? And there are some that only eat decaying organisms, and we usually call these detritivores. Detritivores are things like fungi, ants, and beetles. They eat a lot of dead organism or things like dung, fecal matter. And so, of course, the last one here, we have decomposers, which will usually eat away at rotting flesh and ultimately recycle that chemical energy back into the soil, which then can be used as a form of fertilizer. One more category that we do have listed here is, of course, the scavenger. These are usually organisms that usually wait for either a prey to die or be hunted down by another species, and they'll kind of just clean up after them. Any whatever's left over, they'll eat behind. So usually like hyenas, vultures, and some jackals are usually good examples of scavengers. Now, it says here, we consider organisms according to trophic levels. They often form what we call a food pyramid, with a broad base of primary producers and only a few individuals in the highest trophic levels. And this is kind of how we get that term, top of the food chain. Because when you make a food chain that looks very similar to a pyramid, we as human beings are usually at the very top of that pyramid, as well as other large predators like lions and wolves and bears. There's not much that can usually prey upon us. There are a few exceptions, of course, but we have a large say-so as far as what gets eaten and what gets destroyed when it comes to various organisms out there. And while there is an endless variation in the organization of ecosystems, the pyramid idea does help us describe generally how energy and matter move through ecosystems. So usually when it comes to a pyramid, energy will flow from the bottom to the top. The bottom being the primary producers like plants, and of course they're moving on up through the secondary consumers and the top consumers, and they will usually have the most obviously energy at the very top. So here we see another, again, a breakdown of what that pyramid looks like. And it kind of looks like a rough pyramid, if you could even call it that. But you see how herbivores make up the base of the pyramid. But you see how energy is being kind of run through this pyramid. So obviously most of the energy is being created at the base, which is the producers. And herbivores only get about 16.1% of that energy. And of course, as they keep going to the very top, ultimately we don't get a lot of the energy that's left over. We get very little, which is why we have to continue to consume as much food as necessary to survive in a given day, because we are not receiving all the energy that's available, primarily that which is found in the producers. Now, all this energy has to go somewhere, and it is for a purpose. So we usually refer to these as the biogeochemical cycles and life process. In other words, how are these chemicals that we are producing, whether it's nitrogen, carbon, phosphorus, these various chemicals that we are very dependent on, how is it being cycled through this ecosystem? And so you got to remember again, it's this giant cycle that's just continuing and continuing. And so this movement on a global scale is referred to as biogeochemical cycling. There's a naturalist known as John Muir who said, when one tugs at a single thing in nature, he finds it attached to the rest of the world. So, and again, it kind of helps to summarize that circle of life. Even we, as human beings, when we die, we leave behind a lot of chemical energy. We decompose, and we leave various forms of carbon, nitrogen, sulfur, phosphorus as our body decays. So we become part of this single thing in nature that gets tugged at through by various other organisms. And so there are many cycles that we go through in this ecosystem, and the first one being the hydrologic cycle. And this usually refers to the movement of water through an environment. And that is one that we're probably most familiar with because water is so important in our life. In fact, when it comes to looking for other life on other planets, usually the first thing we look for is water. And the reason why it's so important because it can play such a huge role in not only sustaining our bodies, but sustaining our environment, sustaining our habitat. It says here that water that condenses over land surfaces usually does so in the form of rain, snow, or fog, which helps to support these terrestrial ecosystems. And we ourselves, we emit a lot of the moisture that we have to kind of break down in our body, usually through sweating or respiration. And this water, this vapor that we leave behind usually re-enters the atmosphere and eventually gets deposited into lakes and other bodies of water. So again, it shows that it's not only just the organisms that we eat, but the chemicals that we ourselves process is gone through a cycle, gone through a circle that can be reused many, many times over. So here we see an example of water that's just being used and then reused as it makes its way back into the atmosphere and then back down, usually in the form of precipitation. And that precipitation will then make its way back due to runoff into estuaries or rivers, and it will make its way back into the ocean, which of course will then evaporate once again and repeat this process. The next cycle that we run into in this book is known as the carbon cycle. The carbon cycle usually begins with photosynthetic organisms taking up carbon dioxide. Plants usually breathe, and I put quotes around this word. They breathe carbon dioxide, and so this process is what we call carbon fixation. Because what's happening is they're changing the chemical known as CO2 into an organic molecule such as sugar, which is then, of course, used by the plant to power itself. And eventually, when we eat this sugar that's produced by plants, we will absorb this sugar molecule into our bloodstream where it becomes used by our cells, usually in the form of cellular respiration or through the production of complex molecules. And of course, once we use up this sugar and we perform various functions in our body, we then exhale CO2 and the process continues all over again. The CO2 then is breathed in by the plant and continues life as it continues always all the time. And so, as I mentioned before, it's not only the carbon that we breathe out, but it's also the carbon that we leave behind when we die that plays such an important role in this carbon cycle. It says here, carbon in the wood of a 1,000-year-old tree will be released only when fungi and bacteria digest the wood and release carbon dioxide as a byproduct. So, same thing with us. When we die, the carbon that's being held within our bodies will be broken down by the fungi and bacteria that consume us, and they will be able to release that carbon in the form of carbon dioxide and other chemical forms, which will then be useful to supplying nourishment to the earth and the atmosphere. And so again, very similarly to the water cycle that we saw a while ago, the carbon cycle also shows how we consume carbon and we then return that carbon back into the atmosphere. And it just kind of continues all the time. We also have something called the nitrogen cycle. Very depend on nitrogen as well. If you learn anything about biochemistry, you learn that our body is made up of protein, and that protein is made up of smaller parts known as uh, amino acids. And they get their name amino or amine because of the presence of nitrogen. And we need this nitrogen to do a variety of functions. But other organisms, as well as bacteria and plants, they all absorb nitrates or nitrogens to help them function. These nitrates are used either as a form of food or as a way of producing their own proteins as well. And most of this nitrogen is captured in bacteria or around the roots of certain plants, and then of course converted into a usable form of nitrogen. And as I mentioned before, it's kind of restated here, but we use that nitrogen as we incorporate it into our body to create a lot of the protein molecules. And when we die, of course, a lot of this nitrogen is broken down and returned back into the soils and the atmosphere as well, either as a gas that can be used later up in the upper atmosphere. I don't know if you realize this, but a lot of the atmosphere is not oxygen, but it is a combination of various chemicals like nitrogen, phosphorus, and oxygen that are up there. So once again, we see a similar image that shows how nitrogen is being recycled throughout the ecosystem, whether it's through the water or through the various plants and animals that consume nitrogen, and then of course they release it in the form of excretion, and it's put back into the system as well. And this last cycle that we're going to be looking at here, or one of the last cycles, excuse me, is the phosphorus cycle. So phosphorus here usually involves recycling within ecosystems through erosion and sedimentation of phosphorus-bearing rock. So a lot of these phosphorus will be found in inorganic beings such as rocks and other bodies of soil, and then they will be captured usually through runoff or through other organisms, and of course be recycled back into the atmosphere. However, if you have such a thing as excess phosphorus or excess phosphates in water, it can actually cause an explosion of algae growth. And we saw something similar to this earlier in the chapter when we looked at the problem with Chesapeake Bay being polluted. It was producing too much phosphates, which was leading to too much algae being created in the water, which then led to the blockage of a lot of sunlight in plants that were found underneath the algae. And so it would upset the stability of the entire ecosystem. So it's important to keep a good balance, and not just to maintain the cycle, but to maintain a good equilibrium so that we don't kind of wreak havoc on the way everything's functioning on this earth. And then lastly, we have the sulfur cycle. We produce a lot of sulfur in this earth, usually through emissions from volcanic eruptions, as well as sulfur that comes from a lot of the animals that are out there. Animals tend to fart a lot, and in that fart, as silly as it sounds, we contain a lot of sulfur. And if you have a lot of excess sulfur, it can actually be a bad thing for the ozone layer. So we see a lot of this happening in places like India, where if you look at an ozone layer map of the Earth over India, we see a very hot spot. And that is because there's so much emissions of sulfur going up into the atmosphere that it's kind of slowly eroding a bit of the ozone layer. And of course, we as human, we have a lot of human activities that usually lead to large amounts of sulfur being built up, and usually it's done through the burning of fossil fuels. And the dangerous part about this is, as the fuels accumulate, in the form of smog and smoke in the atmosphere, it can lead to what we call acid precipitation, which is precipitation that is, again, as the name implies, it's acidic in nature rather than neutral. Water should always be ideally in a neutral state, but when you start to have acid precipitation, you can start having rain that will start to erode rocks and various parts of the ecosystem, and just wreak havoc as well. And so we see that, of course, we are not the only thing responsible for the emission of sulfur. There are a lot of other organisms as well that produce sulfur. And so this can have a negative effect when it comes to the feedback mechanism. If you recall, we talked about feedback loops earlier in this chapter, and we see that if we create a negative feedback, usually the result of that is we see changes in the Earth's climate, the Earth's temperature. And that is a negative feedback loop. We're seeing the effects of all these emissions that are going into the atmosphere that are wreaking havoc on, the overall stability of the ozone layer and other parts of the climate. And so hopefully we can correct these things to create a positive feedback loop later on in the future generations to come. And so once again, we have an image that kind of shows how the sulfur is being kind of just recycled. We see some volcanic activity that releases sulfur in the atmosphere, which of course then leads to it being put into water molecules and being rained down as sulfuric acid or acid rain down into the earth, which of course can lead to problems when you have a lot of acid rain that rains down from the sky. So in conclusion, really, if you want to summarize this entire chapter, not just these last parts, you have to make sure that you understand how matter, how energy just kind of work all together to move through the ecosystem, to keep the ecosystem running and hopefully running in equilibrium, meaning in a good balance. When you start to upset that balance is when you start to see problems arise. Usually it's the result of, climate change or lack of resources because you have an imbalance of how you're eating your organisms. And so, again, it's very important that you understand everything that we've gone through in this chapter, how we compose matter. What are the main components that we have? Things like water, carbon, oxygen, nitrogen, phosphorus, and sulfur, and understand the hierarchy of how we consume, organisms. What is a primary producer? What is a primary consumer, a secondary consumer, and the top consumers, and how they all relate to each other to form what we call the food chain and the food web. So I hope that this chapter has been helpful to you. Be on alert on Blackboard to figure out what the next assignment will be in regards to this chapter. I will see you again in chapter 3, which will probably be a longer video, as I am going to try to start putting chapters together as a single chapter instead of breaking them apart into 2 parts. I will see you then, and have a great day.